Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kia ora tātou, I'm Mark Prain. For those of you who don't know me, it's been my enormous privilege to be the Executive Director. I'm now the Founding Director of the Hillary Institute of International Leadership, where I've been for a decade. It's been a blessed time, and largely because of these folks behind me. On the wall you can see the global laureates who started in 2009, Jeremy Leggett from the UK, the founder of Carbon Tracker and Solar Century. Next to him, Peggy Liu, who's a force majeure really in China, an interface between China and the world in terms of clean tech. Right next to her, Amy Christensen, long-established US Beltway networker extraordinaire across the US. And next to her, only Tuakana Taina. People ask me, have we ever had a New Zealander? The answer is we've come very close, and our founding chairman David Kagan and I had a glorious week with the president of Kiribati, Noti Tong, in 2012 up with his community. Next to him, Atosa Sultane, the legendary founder of Amazon Watch, and on the left-hand corner, Michael Brune, currently the chief executive of the Sierra Club. And as Anaki says, we are now up to 007, and please join me in welcoming, thank you, Alex, a truly remarkable human being, radical economist, dramatist, and in terms of the existential challenges we all face, certainly addressing the issues that are most pertinent right now. So just before I welcome Tim to the stage, I do have a long list in my left hand I'm not going to read. There have been people held up because they are out of their homes. There have been people held up in Auckland Airport, and we have a number of apologies. It's extraordinary given the events of the last 72 hours, and I thank you graciously, one and all, that you are here today in that context. As someone on the Port Hills, I do share the reality of what's happening over there, and so it's wonderful to have you all with us. So please join me now in welcoming Tim Jackson, the Director of the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity in the UK, and my challenge to you, Tim, given the delays tonight, and indeed my challenge to Ian, welcome, and to Yosef, welcome, is to effectively treat your presentations tonight as TED Talks. In other words, we're looking at sort of 10 to 15 minutes max. And it's simply we should have started half an hour ago, but we are constrained. That'll be a wonderful discipline, which I'm sure we'll all enjoy. Please join me in welcoming Tim Jackson.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Annika. Thank you to the Hillary Foundation. I think it may be the first time 007's been asked to finish on time and under budget, but I'll do my best in the circumstances. It is fantastic to be here. It's a real pleasure and a privilege, and I'd like to thank you for the honour that you've accorded me and the hospitality that you've given to myself and Tilly. I've done some pretty scary things in my time, actually, not the least of which was launching a report called Prosperity Without Growth to the UK government. The Sustainable Development Commission reported directly to the Prime Minister, and the idea of putting those two words in the same title, without and growth, at a point when actually what the UK government was trying to do was to stimulate, kickstart in the language, growth as fast as possible, was one of those scary moments. Right up there next to it is talking in front of my 16-year-old daughter. So my nerves tonight are all for you, Tilly, as is my admiration, as is my commitment to your generation, because I think in a way it is that commitment that binds us to the tasks that we are attempting to undertake. Each generation, of course, rejects the previous generation, and it's right that they should do so because the values of the previous generation have moved and will move on. And yet each generation has to respect the generation that follows, and indeed ultimately will learn to respect the generation that precedes them, because we're connected. We're all connected in a chain of life and of evolution that is probably the most important task that we will ever have to engage in. And it's a task that fascinates me for all sorts of reasons. One of the reasons is because it asks huge questions about who we are. What is our story? What is the story of Edmund Hillary, an extraordinary man who, with the almost unbelievable technology of the day, primitive by the standards that today's assaults on Everest can draw from, scaled the highest peak in the world, the first human being to do so, with the assistance, of course, of Tenzing Norgay. And yet behind Hillary was Mallory. Mallory failed in the attempt some 20 or 30 years earlier with even more primitive equipment, with less insight, with a sense of foreboding perhaps as he attempted this huge feat of personal achievement to reach the highest mountain in the world. A series of giants, a series of people with enormous vision, with enormous courage, pushing at the frontiers of what it means to be a human being. Who are we? Who are we engaged in this task? And somehow coming to realize that actually it was through Mallory's failure that Hillary was able to succeed. It was from learning from the failures of others that we progress as human species. It's out of disaster that we pluck unlikely victory. It's from this history of both achievement and failure that we are able to progress in our understandings. And so this 007 quality, this Edmund Hillary at the peak of Everest quality, is absolutely vital to us because it drives us forward, because it gives us inspiration, because it teaches us about ourselves and about the limits of ourselves. But Hillary's life, in fact, was not entirely defined by being the first human being who accidentally, as it happens, with another human being managed to scale the highest peak. It was defined as much by the small acts of communitarian assistance that over the rest of his life he brought to the impoverished communities of Nepal. The fact that he cared about their education, their health systems, their communities, their prospects, the sense that he gave of himself to other people. And the opposite of 007 is a human being who is small in the face of his daughter and his grandchildren, is a human being who is small in the face of his community, who is anxious for the approval of his peers, who cares about the fate of his community, who is locked, in a sense, bound, in a sense, to those around him and to the web of life, not just by his anxiety, but actually by his and her affiliation to this web of life. We come from nothing, we return to nothing, we are here for such a short period. But who are we? Who are these people who aspire to wonderful things? Who are these people who sacrifice themselves and give up their lives, sometimes in heroic circumstances, in awful circumstances for others? Who are the people who are bound to each other by the emotions of connection, of love, of friendship, of family? They are us. They are all us. And the story of us is this richness. The story of us is this continuity. The story of us is a place where actually we can and should be and are sometimes proud of the fact that we are human. And human in a context where we also are concerned about the other species on the planet, where it matters to us what happens in the paradise of the world that we live in, where the other species, the ones that sustain us relentlessly sometimes, the humble earthworm, the species that pollinate our food supply, that bring us sustenance, that give us the ability to function as human beings, that allow us to stand in a room and ask, who are we? The trees, who remarkably, it's now been shown scientifically, actually are able to communicate with each other across huge distances in ways that we barely begin to understand as living beings in a web of life. And this richness is a story. It is a story worth protecting. But is it the story that economics tells us? Actually, up until now, it hasn't been. And economics, in fact, has something to to address, to redress. Economics has been a story of spectacular, hyper-financialized consumerism, of unbridled materialism. It's been a story of undermining the social relationships that we hold dear by exposing them and cashing them out as material exchanges, as monetary exchanges, as a set of business transactions within which we hope to fulfill this social richness that I was talking about in the beginning. It's a story of spectacular failure also in the crash. The book Prosperity Without Growth, the report to the UK government, was launched just as the system fell down. And I certainly didn't expect that. But as I was writing and seeing this chaos propagating around us, it was underlining to me this sense of a story that devalues humanity, that devalues our relationships, that devalues the connections, that devalues nature itself, that creates spectacular inequality, that trashes biodiversity, that undermines the stability of the climate. It's a story, ultimately, through the crisis, of economics failing even in its own terms. A set of institutions that actually had articulated so much instability that governments had to step in to save what the market was supposed to deliver. And there was never a point at which it was clearer to those who defended the liberality of the market that governments should step in. I remember reading The Economist at the point of the crisis. The Economist, the defender of the free market, the laissez-faire protagonist par excellence, who continually argued that governments should stay out of the way, should not intervene, actually struggled with that message through the crisis in a quite remarkable way. And I remember reading these editorials. Perhaps there is, at this point, for exceptional reasons, a case to be made that government should intervene, at least for now, to stabilize markets, to create a sense of calm, to bring us back to a point where, at some later stage, maybe we can hand that function over again to the most efficient mechanism that there is. And that sense of struggling with this message that The Economist had at the point of the crisis was a part of a change in that story. So the old story of economics, the story of hyper-financialized over-materialism, the story of us being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. It was an old story, a story whose time had come, and a story that the crisis told us was now gone. And it was a point at which we could build, we could reflect, we could think again about how to have a proper economy, a proper sense of economy embedded in society. And that was and is really the thrust of what I have been writing about ever since. And in this revised edition of Prosperity Without Growth, what I've tried to do is go further and further towards what I believe to be a fundamental, pragmatic, definable, and meaningful task. And that task can be based around a very, very simple question. It was, in fact, the question that I asked of government departments after the publication of the initial report, and it was a simple one. Where is the economy of tomorrow? What kind of economy does it have to be? It cannot be the one that trashes the climate and undermines biodiversity. It cannot be the one that wrecks community and creates inequality. It cannot be an economy in which investment is an exercise in gambling, in which the financial sector is a casino, in which we bet on the success of our own future as a human species. We have to transform economics. We have to tell a different story. We have to ask that question over and over again. Where is the economy of tomorrow? Where is the enterprise of tomorrow? What does enterprise look like when it's caring for the planet and for the people who inhabit it? What does investment look like when it is properly integrated into a meaningful sense of prosperity? And what I've tried to do in Prosperity Without Growth is built on conversations, built on relationships, built on working with the financial sector and working with community organizations. It's built on the experience of going to places like Greece where things went desperately wrong. It's built on the experience of working with economists in Malaysia thinking about a 100-year plan for their own economy. It's built on talking to people and understanding actually that this task, this pragmatic task, is ultimately down to us. Who are we? We are people who create the social institutions of our economy. Who are we? We're the people who invest. What is that investment in an economy that's working? What is it for tomorrow? Investment, in my view, one of the most fundamental aspects of economics, is at heart very simple. It's the relationship that we have between the present and the future. It tells us that we care about that future. If there were no future, there would be no investment. Investment is about laying down the foundations for prosperity tomorrow. And you can articulate that. Once you reject the idea that it's just a casino economy, you can say, what should we be investing? Where is our commitment for tomorrow? Our commitment is to renewable energy. It's a commitment to resource productivity. It's a commitment to low carbon transition. It's a commitment to the infrastructure of civic life. It's a commitment to health. It's a commitment to education of our children. It's a commitment to the ecological assets. And these have to become the focus of our investment. It's a task that we can engage in. It's a meaningful task that we can engage in. It's a task that demands to be engaged in because the existing financial architecture has led us to the brink of disaster. And instead of rewarding the architects of chaos by bailing out everything over generations and generations, we have to think systematically about how to reform capital, how to reform finance, how to make investment work for us. Capitalism is, to some extent, a history that belongs to our time. We financialized it, we created the institutions of it, we looked at our world through it, we fought our battles through it. And one of those battles was the battle between capital and labor. The contrast between capitalism and communism. And we have to think differently. As we think differently about capital, we also have to think differently about labor. What does it mean to work? And work, in the aftermath of the crisis and indeed before the crisis, was systematically being robbed of its importance in our lives. There were too many work slaves. There were too many who had 0-hour contracts. That number is increasing. It was creating huge inequality. The difference between wages and profits was being skewed increasingly towards profits and away from wages. And it was creating not just social injustice, but financial insecurity as well. And yet, just as we can rethink investment as a commitment to the future, we can also rethink work. What is it? Who are we? Why would we work? We would work because it is a way to participate in society, because it is a way to bring value to society, because it's a way to co-create the world that we want, because it's a way to improve the quality of others. And this vision of work as a participation, as a meaningful participation in society, is just as powerful as a reconstruction as the idea that investment is a commitment to the future. And it's a way of thinking about the tragedy of the financial crisis, where 50% of young people in Europe were out of work after the crisis. And there's something not just tragic about that, but almost unbelievable, because actually what economics is supposed to do is to supply what is demanded in the economy. Now, there was no employment there, but were there things to be done in that economy? Were there people who needed care? Yes. Were there people who would have benefited from education? Yes. Were there people who were mentally ill who needed support? Yes. Were there disabled people in the community? Yes. Were there buildings to be renovated? Yes. Were there ecological assets to be protected? Were there places where we could build community? Was there any deficit at all in the tasks that needed to be done? No. All there was an economics no longer fit for purpose. And our task, and it's a task that we've begun rather than finished, is to reconstruct that economics, to tell a different story, to tell a story of economics as though people and planet mattered, really mattered. And if you think this is a kind of radical, novel, absolutely impossible dream, you don't have to look very far into the great architects of economics, the founders of economics, to find that they had, in fact, almost exactly the same vision. So John Stuart Mill, for example, writing in 1848, foresaw this prosperity without growth and asked the question, is the economy that we're looking at one that we should be proud of? I, for one, he said, am not much enthralled by this place where people are clawing over each other, thrusting forward, trying ever to better for themselves as individuals. The best state of human nature, he said, is where people want for nothing, and the striving for success is never felt, and the anxiety of being constantly thrust back by the demands of other people recedes into the distance. John Maynard Keynes, in 1932, wrote an essay called Possibilities, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And in that, he had the same vision, a vision of an economy that works. The economy of tomorrow is an economy that works. The economy of tomorrow is an economy that invests for prosperity. The economy of tomorrow is an economy in which people can participate meaningfully in society. The economy of tomorrow is a place, actually, where government reclaims its ability to act progressively for its own citizens. The economy of tomorrow is a place in which I would be proud if my daughter could live. Thank you all very much for your attention, and thank you for this award.